Okay. Today we're going to be talking about the poem Animals by Joshua Corey. If we're going through Tip Fast, a method of analyzing poetry, you of course start with the title. So the first thing you notice about animals is that there's going to be some natural world imagery in there. Because it's a poem about animals, we are animals ourselves, there might be some sort of connection between, so we know it's going to be about the natural world. We can tell that from the title. Then we move into paraphrase, where we attempt to summarize the poem, what it captures, but not moving on into a theme or the tone or anything. So we'll talk about shifts a little bit later, but there are many different parts of the poem. It describes, first off, we already said that we think it's going to be about the natural world. It is. So there's the natural world aspect. There's also the human world, the world that we have built for ourselves all throughout history. So the human world. And then it also discusses spirituality, moving into that last section of the poem where it talks about our connection with God, what we have. So spirituality. So we've paraphrased the poem. We know what, in essence, it's talking about. Basically, the poem is trying to say that we move, there's so many different aspects of the world. We have the natural world with animals, the megafauna. We have the human world, what we've built, mathematics, and all the stuff that we have built. The spiritual world, our connection with God, how He interacts with our lives. And in the last paragraph, he talks about how he, being Joshua Corey, talks about how we connect with all these different aspects of the world. He achieves a lot of this through the use of figurative language. One of the major things that I would like to talk about with figurative language is flight imagery. So we look at line 20, moving down into line 25 and beyond. One of the major things that happens there is the transition from animals to humans. And a major theme with poetry would be flight imagery. The fact that animals can fly, especially birds, can fly, and humans cannot. So that flight imagery, that transition, moving from animals to humans, is an excellent example of how he uses a past theme or a past motif from poems before him to transition from topics. So flight imagery is definitely something that we look at in this poem. Another thing that Corey does really well is using excellent diction. If you want to look at some examples, in line 6, he uses the word megafauna, which is kind of a hodgepodge of words. Fauna meaning flora and fauna, flora being plant life, fauna being animal life, mega meaning huge. And it goes from talking about megafauna, it kind of defines in the next line, in line 7, polar bears, moose, rippling massive flanks to shake loose hitting flies, these big animals. So megafauna is one word. You've also got words like principalities in line 47, and other words like that throughout the poem that really give it kind of an academic tone, which we'll talk about in just a second. One last thing with figurative language, talking about the syntax. Corey uses long sentences broken up with commas. So it's choppy, but the ideas are flow from line to line, and there aren't very many sentences in the poem. And that, again, goes back to the tone that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Tip Fast uses the word attitude, but it really just means tone. Attitude. So the biggest tone word that we have for this poem is reflective, because it calls for us to look at our own emotions to interpret the poem. Poetry, it's very hard to find the one meaning that's overlapping for everyone. This poem is especially difficult because everyone looks at life in a different way. And it just calls for you to look at what your personal perspective is. And so you can tell that throughout the poem because you've got these long ideas, and rather than ideas that are made to sound like statements, things that are proven to be true. These are ones that are called for us to think about. So you've got reflective. It also has an academic and philosophical tone. Again, leading back to that diction, you have all these different words that call us to think about the things that humans have created over time throughout history, mathematics, philosophy, architecture, everything that we have created. So it takes an academic mind to think about that in its entirety because it's a huge part of our lives as people. So that's how we talk about tone. This poem uses shifts. That was not a very good shift to talking about shifts, but we're going to talk about shifts. There are lots of smaller shifts throughout the poem, when especially this one talking about flight imagery. But the biggest shift in the poem is at line 51 through 52, where it goes from talking about things that are proven to be true, that we can observe with our eyes, to talking about things that are spiritual, and moving on into the back. It goes all the way through line 65. The spiritual body. That phrase, it's short, it's small, it has its own line. He only does that a few times throughout this poem. That is a definite shift. Because as he moves into talking about spiritual life, it goes back to that reflective tone. And we are called to think about what our connections truly are and who we truly are as people. Now, we look at the title again and we think about it as not only something that's talking about the natural world, but it's talking about all encompassing. We are animals, just like squirrels and bears and Christian's bull suit. We are all animals. But that doesn't define us. We define ourselves. We define ourselves. The most important thing that this poem talks about is theme. The overall meaning, the universal truth. Now, this poem's universal truth is a little bit complicated because it's not as universal as some others, because there's room for interpretation. So I'm going to try and make this as clear as possible. While we explore the many facets of life and society, we just need to be. Just need to be. Now that may seem a little confusing, but when we flip over onto the back and we go between lines 75 and 80, it talks about is not of me or the we or of God or of animals. Corey means to say that our life isn't dictated by the things that we see around us, the connections that other people have. We are our own person. We are our own individual soul. And that should shape how we go about our lives. Not the past, not what we see around us, not what the natural world dictates. Of course, there are things that are going to hinder us, but we need to be our own person. And that's what the poem Animals is all about. Thank you.
Oh man, I wanted to like zoom in like